Thanks everyone for joining. Again, this is Karen Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. This is a federal policy update, and this is going to be the first in a series of these leading up to the National Bike Summit, March 24th through 26th. I wanted to do it this way because 2026 is going to be a big year. We've got a lot of action happening at DOT. We also have Congress right now writing and drafting the next 5-year transportation bill. So things may change a lot in the next 5-6 months. And so I wanted to create a way so you can have some of that background going into the summit. And I hope you'll all be able to join us for that. The National Bike Summit is really the annual national gathering of bike advocates. We're going to have some great speakers, some great sessions, but we also get to have mobile workshops, get out, do some rides. And I still think some of the best parts of this is really just the opportunity to see each other and interact with each other. I know we're all sort of fighting the good fight in our own spaces, and it's great when we can come together and share those experiences. We're already ready to introduce one of our keynote speakers, which will be Amy Walter. If you watch PBS NewsHours, you know she's on every Monday talking about the political situation. She also is a regular on Meet the Press and Inside Politics and things like that. She is also an avid bicyclist. I actually met her on a ride with the chair of the Congressional Bike Caucus, Representative Mike Thompson. So super excited to have her come. And then if you haven't come to the summit, I would really suggest you do. We have that conference. We also have Lobby Day, which is incredibly valuable when we look at transportation and bicyclists getting recognized in federal policy. It's an opportunity for us to show the breadth and the depth of our movement. So we have a picture from the Hawaii delegation and a picture from the Louisiana delegation. You never know, you might come and find out your member of Congress has an alligator in their office. But last year was super helpful because we had lists of all the grants that your state had been awarded. And on the day that we went up to the Hill, we found out that the Department of Transportation, the US Department of Transportation, said it was going to freeze grants that had bike projects in it. So it was an opportunity for the bike advocates to be the first person to share that news with their senators and representatives' offices, but also to show them real people who care about this and are going to be hurt by this policy. So, you know, it was super helpful to have everyone here ready to speak on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on at the DOT and in Congress. But since this is the first of a series, I wanted to just start with some background data on federal transportation funding, just to give you a little bit of a background, set the table. So this is looking at federal spending for biking and walking from 1989 to 2023. And you can see the increase. It was 1991, 1992 when we first got the ICE-T, the first federal transportation bill that set aside funding for biking and walking. And then you can see it generally progress up from there. Where you see the dips is often on years where the transportation bill gets extended or they're in the process of writing the next one, like we are now. And that has been because partially in the past, the states weren't sure that these programs were going to continue, so they sort of pulled back. And sometimes they're just uncertain when the next bill is going to come, and so they pull back in general. But it always feels like biking and walking funding is one of the first things they pull back on. So you can see the dips. There was another bill in 1998. Another reason for the dip also could be the bill comes out and there's changes to the programs. So they have to work on those changes before the funding goes out. So another bill in 2025. 2009 was the stimulus bill under President Obama, where we got 3% of all that new transportation money, so we saw a big spike there. We got a new bill in 2012, a new bill in 2015, and then a new one in 2021. We got the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So you can see also how that last bill, that 2021 bill, really made a difference in biking and walking spending. One of the reasons we really needed to see that increase in funding is because when we look at the number of bike ped projects, even though we're getting more and more money, it's translating to fewer projects. And that may be a good thing. We may be getting better, more substantial projects, but there is that cause and effect there. And then finally, I want to talk about the two types of programs and funding. So roughly 90% of transportation funding comes out as formula funding. This is money that goes directly to the states. So the states get an automatic allocation. How much a state gets is based on factors like number of lane miles, population, vehicle miles traveled. And then that funding is divided up by program. So you get X number for safety, X number for congestion mitigation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the vast majority of it. And that's what state DOTs or their association AASHTO really wants. The last 10% is that discretionary funds where local governments or states have to compete and they apply to the US DOT. So Congress sets criteria and goals, but then the US DOT runs it. They set application requirements. They really do have a lot of discretion, hence discretionary programs. Traditionally, sustainable transportation advocates have often wanted more of this because it comes with a set of criteria and you have to compete. And the thinking is you're going to get better projects if you have to compete for the funding. All right. So one last slide, and this is looking at the formula funding that goes to biking and walking. The biggest part of that is transportation alternatives, and some of the legacy programs. It used to be called something else. There's still some old transportation enhancements money. Safe Routes to School is there. If you look at the back, the second to the right, this RTP, that is recreational trails. That also sort of comes out of TAP. And then I also have this all other funds. If you've heard me say this before, I say roughly 50% comes out of TAP. That's because the people that keep the records on this are the accounting people in state DOTs, and we know that they are recording TAP wrong. So we believe that probably 2/3 of this all other funds is also TAPs. So that's transportation alternatives. This is the only program meant for local governments to fund their priority projects. The next one, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. This is a program that's very flexible funding, and the majority of it is suballocated, which means that it has to go, more of it goes to local governments. There's a lot more local control in there. The next one is congestion mitigation and air quality, where if you have a community that isn't meeting the Clean Air Act standards, it's considered non-conforming or in maintenance, and so they have to spend the money on projects that aren't single vehicle lanes. So we do really well in that. That one is often also suballocated, so local governments have more say in that. HSIP is highway safety. You'll see that we got a big increase in 2023, and that's because the changes in that 2021 bill kicked in. The next one is the carbon reduction program. That one also was just created in 2021, so there's nothing from 2019 to 2021. But then you can see as it started going, it was ramped up. That one is also suballocated, also has a lot of local control. You don't have to memorize that. I just wanted to give you a bit of a breakdown on that. If you want a little more of a deep dive into the different programs, how big those programs are, and how much gets spent on biking and walking, we'll share these slides with you. And this is a video I did for University of Washington's sustainable transportation class. that goes through each of the programs, how much of the overall highway funding it is, federal highway administration funding, and then what percent goes to bike ped, how it can be used, that kind of thing. So there is that deep dive resource for you. But I showed you that chart because I wanted to just talk about some of the lessons we've learned over the years. And that is, one, having that dedicated funding mattered. It really mattered back in the 90s and the aughts, but it still does, especially in a lot of states that haven't spent a lot of money on biking and walking. Sometimes the only money they spend is that transportation alternatives, which is why we continue to talk about that. The other thing we know is that suballocated funds, which means more local control, equals more biking and walking projects. And that's one of the reasons we really push for local control. The other thing is that we are beginning to see an increase in funding on safety, which was something that was required under the 2021 IIJA Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that's just a little bit of background. I'll refer back to some of that, but we'll also show the slides again when I do. Just wanted to stop quickly and see if there's any clarifying questions on that.
Yes. Karen, Andy asked, is the federal spending chart formula funding only or both formula and discretionary?
So, oops, going the wrong way. This one is just the formula, but the other two at the beginning, those include both. And if you go to data.bikeleague.org, you can see a little more write-up on both of those. All right, so let's talk about the DOT. This administration hasn't been the most friendly to bikes, if we want to say that. We put out this action alert recently because Secretary Duffy asked for public input on what folks wanted to see in the next reauthorization bill, because the US DOT and the administration are writing their priorities. We pushed that out to folks. We didn't give you a written email to send. We said, please say something. And so many people did it. We were 70% of the responses. So we're looking to see how they respond to that, if they report out on that. But even if we can't, have the biggest effect on what they do, it's always important that they know that people are pushing back. Let's see. So again, we talked about formula versus discretionary. The formula funds, that transportation alternatives, the surface transportation block grant, that's all right now decided at the state level. What I'm going to talk about now is the discretionary grants, that 10% that the US DOT gets to decide on. Because one of the things that we've seen, and you've probably heard, is there's been a lot of talk about these canceled grants. So here's what happened. Under IIJA, it was a huge bill. There was more money than, they said it was a, investment of a lifetime. So there was a lot of money that went to the DOT, either through existing programs or new programs. Under the Biden administration, they worked really hard to get those programs up and running, but it took a lot of time. So during those years from 22 to 24, the Biden administration awarded roughly 6,600 awards. But on January 20th, when the Trump administration came through, only half of those had a signed grant agreement, which means they were under contract. And the sponsor, whether it was a local government or a state, was ready to build. There was another, the number I've seen is 3,269 were in process, but they didn't have a grant agreement. So they still needed to get that grant agreement with the US DOT in order to process the grant, in order to actually spend that money. At that point, the Trump administration froze a lot of those grants. They've slow walked a bunch of those. They've required modifications to a number of them. So we didn't see those go out quite as fast. This spring and summer, We did see some move. Generally, the ones we saw move were moved because a member of Congress or a governor or somebody got to Secretary Duffy and said, you know what, this is really important to me. And that does two things, right? It gets a couple of grants moving, which is not the process that we want, um, right? We don't want them randomly picked because they have a powerful ally. But two, it kept all of those possible allies, less likely to criticize the whole program because they were trying to get their 1, 2, 3 grants through. We did see some modified to Trump administration. We did see a bunch of court cases say you have to move, and so they started moving a little more. As of September, USDOT said they reviewed all of the grants. So everything has now been reviewed again, and they released a list of um, almost 3,000 of those grants. And they said these can move forward. And so it's funny because they're sort of doing a second grant award. Early on, Secretary Duffy was saying, oh, Buttigieg went out and did the easy stuff and said, congratulations, you got an award. But he didn't do the hard work of getting them under the contract. What we're seeing now with the Duffy administration is he's doing that easy part again. He's again saying, yes, your award counts, you can move forward. So we saw most of those move forward. There is that, I guess, 71 that are sort of in limbo, or 264, excuse me. That's because 7 bike ped grants, those were build race grants, those were canceled. And they were canceled under the argument that they're quote unquote hostile to cars. So we know those have been canceled, but there's this other set that are in limbo. The other thing to note is even on that list of 3,000 projects, there's some of them that were awarded using fiscal year 2022 dollars, and those dollars should have now expired. They expired October 1st. So there may be another set of projects that aren't going to move forward. There are ways they could have extended that, but they don't seem to have done this. So not a great sign for where they're going in reauthorization. Well, the next steps on this is if you have a canceled grant, we're really trying to ask people to push out to their senators and their representatives and your governors and ask them to intervene. I don't know that they can get the money back, but we want to make this decision to cancel them painful. We want to make it, we want Duffy to hear about it. We want those members of Congress to hear about it so that they try to stop it moving forward. Now, if your grant is on the go-ahead list, the next thing to do is move it ahead as fast as you can. Obviously, yeah, and the USDOT is still working during the shutdown. So they should still be able to get that going. Because the 2023, so one thing I want to say is that the fiscal year that the dollars come from is not necessarily the same as when the community was told it won an award. And that Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, ATIP, is a great example of that. All that money came from fiscal year 2023, but the awards weren't announced until January 2025. But despite that, that funding is going to run out, is going to expire October 1st, 2026. So if you have an ATIP grant or you're working with a local government that has an ATIP grant, you really need to push them to get that grant agreement. There was also some congestion relief grants that are the same. And if you're in one of those limbo grants, you also need to push your electeds, excuse me, to get an answer from the DOT, because some of those mega grants, there was a $96 million grant to help finish the bike lanes around Manhattan. I'm not sure what year funding that was, but those things need to get moving too. So another example of a discretionary grant is that Safe Streets for All grant, where I think it's over 1,600 communities got a planning grant to do a safety grant. And then there were more grants to implement projects from those. Most of those, so almost all of the 2022 grants were already under contract before Trump came into office, of the 2023 grants, I think it was almost 60% were already under contract. So it's really the 2024 list that we need to be worried about. Will has gone through those lists, and we'll put something in the chat on that to show which ones are going forward. Same thing applies to all of these. I've gotten a lot of questions about, do we know who won, what the awards are for the 2025 Safe Streets for All? I haven't seen that yet. I don't have a sense of timing on that. So, and just also to talk about these discretionary grants, there's one program, it was started in 2009, it was called Tiger under Obama, it was called Build under Trump, it was called Raise under Biden, and now it's Build again. Basically, the criteria for this program hasn't changed since 2009, but this chart sort of gives you an example of what kind of discretion the US DOT has on those, right? So biking and walking, when we got 6% under Obama, we thought it was the best thing in the world, right? We usually get less than 2% of funding, so it was like a 6% seemed great. Under the Trump administration, we didn't get any bike ped projects, but we did get a few that were labeled complete streets. So you can see that there. But under the Biden administration, at least based on awards, we got over 20%. As we go into the next Trump administration, we're probably back at 0. So, one of the questions I've been getting is, should we still be talking about discretionary grants, even if we're not going to get any under this administration? And one thing I'd say is that the next transportation bill is going to outlive this administration. Most of it is going to be implemented in the next administration. So don't give up. Don't give up on these discretionary grants. So one of the ways we've seen US DOT affect biking and walking is through those grants. Another way is through some of the policy decisions. Again, in that 2021 IIJA bill, there was language that said that bridge projects must include biking and walking access if they could do so within a reasonable cost. The Buttigieg DOT defined that as anything under 20% of the total cost of the bridge project was reasonable. And they also implemented the process with the idea that they assumed you were going to put bike ped access onto the bridge, and the burden was on the project sponsor to say, actually, it's going to cost more than 20%, and here's the math. Under the Duffy DOT, we've heard that they basically don't think there is a cost that is, any cost is unreasonable for bike ped. We've even seen some cases where they've tried to redo a bridge and remove pedestrian access when it was there on the old bridge. So just something to watch and to think about, that these sorts of policies that were promoting complete streets, promoting biking and walking access, are being implemented and interpreted differently now. Another question I get is, so where is AASHTO on this? AASHTO is the Association of State DOTs. And it's been a push-pull with them for a while. They've always had a really strong relationship with DOTs. With the state DOTs, there's a lot of people that go back and forth between US DOT and the state DOTs. They were really helpful at the beginning of the year when they were able to get transportation funding unfrozen. They've been helpful, especially at the beginning when it looked like more grants were going to get through that, because they were really pushing the administration to focus forward, talk about, you get to make your stamp in the next set of grants, but just let these ones that have already been worked on, already applied for, already in the grant agreement process, just let those go forward. They weren't completely successful in that, but I think we would be in a much worse position if AASHTO didn't take that position. At the same time, as we get into reauthorization and the writing of the next bill, AASHTO has some priorities that we may not agree with that are going to have outsized influence. because one of the big things they've been saying is, look, we're the state DOTs, we know best, we know how to spend the money most efficiently, so you don't need discretionary programs. Um, it's taking local governments too long to get those programs on the ground. We can do it faster, just give it to us. Give us the flexibility to do what we know how to do. So that's just, again, part of that push-pull we have with AASHTO moving forward. In some ways, we heard from a lot of state DOTs that had applied for projects and bridge projects that had bike and walking access, and they were saying things like, oh, we're just going to make it vehicle breakdown lane or wide shoulder. We'll come back later with our own money and put in bike ped. And that's helpful, right? Because as long as that space is there, there's the opportunity to use it. So to watch that. Moving forward, I think that relationship between AASHTO and USDOT is going to get even tighter, even closer. Right now, the executive director of AASHTO, oh, I didn't even put their names here, but this is Jim Timon on the left. He's the executive director of AASHTO. On the right is the new FHWA administrator, Sean McMaster. And these two used to work together in Congress during the writing of the last, of a reauthorization bill that came out in 2012. That was not a great bill for biking and walking. In fact, the bill that they helped write, but they were working for someone else, basically eliminated access for biking and walking to federal funding. Now, we have worked with Jim Timon a lot in the last few years. I think his position has changed on that because there's a lot of state DOTs now that do want to build biking and walking. And so he has been helpful in that way. He's spoken at the National Bike Summit. Some of those things have changed. But I just want to note how close that relationship is now moving forward. The other thing I want to say, we've had a couple more modal administrators that have been confirmed. Jonathan Morrison is with NHTSA, that's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They do car safety standards, and they also do the behavior change funding, the non-infrastructure program. Sort of mixed reviews on him. He was at NHTSA when they removed some data on truck safety that could have helped bicyclists and pedestrians, and he removed that from their report on truck safety. On the same time, I've heard from the bike industry that they think that there's some relationship there, and he may be able to help us on some other things. So we're giving him a wait and see. Mark Molinaro is a former member of Congress. He was on the Transportation Committee. I would have characterized him as a moderate Republican. We'd worked with his office a little bit. He is now the FTA administrator. And what I'm hearing from some of the transit advocates who've been talking to him and his people is that he's very interested in transit-oriented development. He sees transit as a critical part of transportation. He's from upstate New York. So we've heard good news on that. So that's sort of where we are with the DOT in some of the characters and some of the things we're watching. Again, we're watching those grants to see if any of those grants that are right now in limbo get out of limbo. And asking members of Congress, governors, other elected officials to push for that, to get those projects moving. The others I'm really watching on the implementation of policy and if some of those things can be addressed through reauthorization and through Congress. All right, I'll stop again briefly to see if there's
Yes.
any questions. Yeah.
We have one from Andy asking a specific question about an action grant award and what year the funding comes from. So Andy, if you email me more details, I can follow up with you about this. And then we have another second question from Michael. He asks, is there any way we can maybe push AASHTO from the state level?
Yeah, I think there are ways that state DOTs can really push AASHTO. The more that your DOT is doing work that is helpful, that's implementing complete streets, that wants biking and walking projects, particularly if it was a project that was canceled or is in that purgatory, that is a state DOT project. Some push from the DOT, particularly from a red state, may really help get those projects moving. Anything that your state DOT can do to ask ASHTO, are you pushing for some of these, for say the Sarah Langenkamp bill, which ASHTO is in favor of. If you can get your DOT to push US DOT on that, that could be super helpful moving forward and on implementation. All right. So now moving into Congress and reauthorization. So again, back in 2021, we got the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It was a huge coup. Congress, President Biden, President Trump had been pushing for it for a long time. We saw a significant increase in funding and policy improvements through this. And we've seen, I showed you some of the funding levels that we've seen, that they've really increased. And so that has been super helpful, at least the bike ped funding. And that Congress is now writing the next 5-year transportation policy bill. A little bit on the debate right now in Congress. The Democrats, in a lot of ways, they just want to maintain the gains they made in IIJA. They want to keep discretionary programs. They want to keep all the funding. I'll talk about advanced appropriations in a minute. And they're sort of just looking for small policy gains because they're in the minority in both chambers. Now, the Republicans, who have the majority, their agenda, they're talking about it as back to basics. We need to get back to the key parts of our transportation system. They say there's too many programs, there's too many overlapping eligibilities in programs. They want to make it a little more simple. They want to, they're hearing what ASHTO is saying about we need to reduce discretionary programs. Let's just give it to the states, give them the flexibility to do what they want to do. There's also some talk about reducing spending, so that's going to be interesting. They don't want any new car regulations. And one of the big things is they want to see permitting reform. They want to see that project delivery go quicker. And there's an interesting thing now, because I started with the administration saying how they were asking for their priorities, or people's priorities. Now they were going to come up with their own priorities. The House is sort of moving ahead on their own bill, where the Senate Republicans have said, oh, well, we want to hear from the administration. So we're waiting to see how that plays out as well. So I know this looks a little weird right now, but in general, transportation funding, these big 5-year bills, most of the funding, or all the funding, would have come from the Highway Trust Fund. It's guaranteed funding. They pass one bill with 5 years of policy, 5 years of funding. That's actually very different from how we do healthcare spending or agricultural spending or anything like that. They also sometimes have will authorize a program that doesn't have funding to it. So that's where the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program ended up, where they authorized it, but they didn't put any funding in it out of the Highway Trust Fund. Just quickly, the Highway Trust Fund, it's like a bank account for transportation. Gas tax goes in there, a few other taxes on trucks and things go in there, and then that money can only be used for transportation. Now, since 2009, I think, we've been throwing in general funds in there as well, but once it's in the Highway Trust Fund, it can only come out for transportation. So this is sort of what a usual bill would look like. Under IIJA, we had this additional column in the middle, which was called advanced appropriations. So it was general funds, but they appropriated it all in 2021 to be spent over the next 5 years. And so one of the big fights now in Congress, or one of the big debates, is how big should the next bill be? Should we just go back to the Highway Trust Fund? Or should the next one be the Highway Trust Fund plus the advanced appropriations? Most people on the transportation committees want it to be both. The Democrats, I think, like the idea of both because a lot of the programs, a lot of the wins they got were in this advanced appropriations column. So it didn't change the core programs, but it added this transit accessibility, it added Safe Streets for All, like half of the Reconnecting Communities money was there, half of the build money was there, that kind of thing. For AASHTO, they want to see it twice as big because it funds their budget, and they just want to see it all become that formula program. So that's one big debate. But if they do this, it's going to mean more deficit spending unless they raise the gas tax. So that's one debate we're watching. They've also had testimony that even if you took out transit and you took out biking and walking, there's still such a deficit that there would still be significant deficit spending because we haven't raised the gas tax since 1993, and we've seen the cost of these programs increase. Okay. So when we say back to basics, they're talking about really, let's just get back to bridges and highways, and let's give the state DOTs more flexibility. They know what's right. There are bipartisan bills in both the House and the Senate that would allow states to flex up to 75% of any program, which means of the safety dollars, they could take $75 of every 100 and say, you know what, we're just going to put that into highway building. We're not going to worry about safety. So that has been a real concern. Right now, in the current law, there's language that protects that suballocated funds, those funds that go to for local priorities, both within transportation alternatives and within our second largest pot of funding, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. So assuming that the protection language stays in the bill, this doesn't affect those two programs, but it does affect these other things, congestion mitigation, safety, other programs. So one of the reasons I showed you that chart before about where the funding for biking and walking comes in is because I also wanted to show you this breakdown of where this is the road funding. It's not the transit, it's the highway and roads funding. So there's a bunch of programs here. Over 50% goes to National Highway Performance Program, which is mostly what it sounds like. It's building highways. And then you have all these other little programs that deal with safety, deal with congestion mitigation, deal with carbon reduction. Protect is about climate resilience, and that sort of thing. So that just gives you a sense. So even though that little orange line, transportation alternatives, is almost about 50% of our funds, it is like one of the tiniest programs there is. National Highways Program, one of the biggest program, that is responsible for less than 0.5% of all the funding that goes to biking and walking. So one of the things we're hearing, particularly from Republican transportation leadership, is that they want to combine programs and reduce redundant eligibilities. So they're saying we'll take congestion mitigation and carbon reduction and protect and tap transportation alternatives and put them all into one program. That has been one of their suggestions. And then we'll say that program funds biking, walking, and can be flexed to transit. And maybe HOV lanes. Like that will be the other things. And then the big pots of money, National Highway, Surface Transportation, that will just be for road building. And that's just, I think that is really dangerous. We've worked for a long time to try to stretch funding across all the programs. When you talk about saying there's only one program that builds biking and walking, and there's one program that builds for motor vehicles, then how do you build a complete street? Right? FHWA has shown that if you put in a bike lane when you're resurfacing a road, you can save 60% of the costs. But if you can only put in a bike lane using one program and you can only resurface using another, we're going to lose out on those opportunities. So that has been something we've been pushing back on. And again, I just wanted to show you this chart because you can see that we've diversified the funding a little bit. Also, we've made requirements in highway safety that if 15% or more of your fatalities are bicyclists and pedestrians, then you have to spend 15% of your safety dollars on that. We want to see that continue. We want to see biking and walking safety projects not just come out of this tiny transportation alternatives program, but come out of the surface transportation block grant, come out of the National Highway Performance Program, come out of highway safety. Another thing we've heard a lot about is this need for permitting reform or project delivery. And I like project delivery a little bit better because that's not just the environmental permitting, it's also the historical, archaeological, other sorts of permitting programs you have to go through. So permitting reform or project delivery reform is something that the Republicans have been pushing for as long as I've been working on this. And at the same time, the environmental groups particularly have been pushing back on it because they see it as sort of the camel's nose under the tent, that they're just going to push, 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 push until we don't have any more environmental protections. And it's true that there have been NEPA reforms in several of the reauthorization bills over the years, and not even all of those reforms have been made. A couple things have happened since then. One is that when the Inflation Reduction Act came out under the Biden administration, which included a lot of climate-related projects, they got caught up in the permitting process. And it was taking forever for those to move. And so that got some Democrats interested in it. Got a picture of Representative Robert Garcia, who's from California. He is on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He is moving up in Democratic politics. He's also the former mayor of Long Beach. And so, he has said in committee, like, I want environmental protection, but we have to make some of these projects easier to build. If you've heard or listened to this idea of abundance, for housing and for transportation, this is all part of it. For us, with the Bike League, this is one of the top 4 issues we've heard from advocates and from local governments. That is a struggle, again, for as long as I've been doing this. And we're seeing the same delays for small projects that you are for large projects. So you're building an interstate, you're putting in bike parking, you're kind of going through the same thing. And so we've been trying to push that whatever permitting reform there should be, it should be for small projects. We're also trying to do something on a program like Safe Streets for All that's like, if it's a safety project, if it's within the disturbed right of way, and if it's under 5 million, let's just move it through. Mixed reviews, but trying to think about ideas on what we can do to help small projects. One example I'll give is there was a local government who got $100,000 to build a sidewalk project between a housing development and a school, and they had to pay $30,000 to get it through the permitting process. That kind of thing makes a project untenable for a small community. The other big issue that's coming up this time is autonomous vehicles and wanting to create a regulatory framework. So a couple things that we've been pushing for. One, we want a vision test to prove that the vehicles can detect and respond to people biking, walking, and rolling. We also want protection for crash victims. There's language that we've seen in the last few bills that have required forced arbitration. So if you have the Uber app or the Lyft app on your phone, you've agreed to forced arbitration if something happens. So we don't want that to happen with this new technology. There's a lot of other things that people want and people care about, and other reasons to like or dislike autonomous vehicles, but those are sort of our top 2. The last few drafts of autonomous vehicle legislation have also included language that would preempt state laws for a decade, for 10 years. So even the last version that the House worked on, it had a vision test in it, but it was going to take 10 years to be in place. So in those 10 years, there would be no vision test, and there would also be no ability to regulate. at the state level or at the national level. And so we'd sort of have this Wild West. That is something that the companies are really pushing for. And it's something that we're hearing from congressional staff. So that is just something else to watch for. Those are some of the really big issues that we're seeing moving forward. I think you know what, I'll stop there and see if there's some questions.
None right now.
Okay. Just quickly to talk about the process and where things are on Capitol Hill. In the House of Representatives, there's 3 committees that have a piece of writing the transportation bill. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee writes 95% of it, all the policy and the funding levels. Energy and Commerce writes a little bit on car safety standards. But because the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee writes most of it, they're the big player. Their chairman is Representative Sam Graves from Missouri. This is his 2026 is his absolute last year that he gets to be chair of this committee. He's already gotten a waiver to extend his term limits. So he wants to do it now. He wants this to be his legacy. So he's invested in getting a bill out quickly. He's talked a lot about wanting a bipartisan bill. Usually the way that happens is something I recently heard termed from the inside out, where the majority staff, in this case the Republicans, would write a section, give it to Democrats, they would respond, the Republicans would start working on a second session, and so you'd work through it that way. This process that they're working on is sort of the outside in, is where the Republicans are going to write the whole bill and then give the whole bill to the Democrats and say, okay, now we have 3 to 4 weeks to debate it. So they're going to start with a very conservative bill and then try to move it to being bipartisan. I would prefer it be the other way, but you know, he didn't ask me. Still there, so he is moving very fast. He says he's going to have a bill out this fall. Before the shutdown, he thought he could get a bill out of the House by the end of the year. I think the shutdown is affecting that. Another thing that's going to affect that is that, you know, Chairman Graves has been around for a while. He knows that if he introduces a bill, gets it through the committee, but then it has to wait 2 months before it gets in front of the whole House. That's a lot of time for criticism, for people to pick it apart and find mistakes and maybe create a movement to defeat it. So he has said he doesn't want his bill hanging out there. So he may wait to introduce it until he knows it can go through the committee, go through the floor really quickly. Here's a little bit of the timeline and where we are now. One thing I want to say is when a bill is released, they introduce it, they only have to leave it out there 3 days before there's a vote. So you may hear the bill gets introduced, and then 2 days later, you may get an email from me saying, you know, please tell your member to do this or do that or say that. It's such a short time period. It's really hard to review the whole bill, figure out the changes we want to make, find a member to introduce them, and then go forward. So just setting expectations for that, and then the same will happen in the House. This is sort of the plan as is, depending on how long the shutdown goes, will depend on how long it's going to take. The Senate process is a little different, although it's 4 committees. The work is spread out a little more. So the Environment and Public Works Committee does the highways title. And by highways, I mean all roads. That includes biking and walking. So they generally lead the process. Their chair is Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia. She is also motivated to get it done because she is also term limited at the end of 2026. The Commerce Committee does the safety, so they do the car safety standards, they do the behavior change funding, and they do discretionary grants. And then the Banking Committee does transit. They usually go last, and then there's a finance title. So where they are right now, EPW is drafting. They are passing the bill back and forth. The Commerce Committee just finished gathering priorities, and they're getting ready to write. They're saying they want to wait and hear what the administration wants. So EPW is pretty much on pace with TNI, but the other committees are a couple steps back, which is usually what happens. I've been doing this since 2009. I've never seen a transportation bill meet the deadline. There's always been an extension. But I will say Congress this time is ahead of where they've been in the past. All right, quickly, I'll talk about the specific sort of bike bills we've been pushing in the next webinar, but a lot of these I think will be familiar to you. We're trying to make it easier to fund biking and walking projects. We want to maintain the Safe Streets for All program. We want to get automatic emergency braking that can detect and respond to motorcyclists and bicyclists. And we want that to be required in new cars. And we want NHTSA to update its biking education curriculum. So those are 4 very specific bike bills that we're working on. These all have links to information. I'll talk about them more in a future webinar. And so when we're thinking about the summit, I'm thinking about those as asks, but I just want to prep people that it's very likely that the House or the Senate will introduce a draft bill before we get to the National Bike Summit. And so those asks may change. It might be that they adopt the Camp bill, and so we don't have to work on that anymore. Or it could be that they remove a policy that we won in IIJA and we have to fight to get that back. Or they could do something completely new, like that eligibility issue, and we might have to really push on that. So one of my goals in these webinars is to keep you up to date on what's happening so that those asks make sense when we get to February and March. And I think, yeah. And then I'll just leave this up there. If you're not on any of our lists, if you want to get basic updates from the league, you can go to our homepage on the contact on the right, sign up for emails. We have a bike walk advocacy group, which we put updates on, but also other advocates can ask questions like, hey, does anyone have a bike share study or something like that? So you can talk to advocates around the country. And then again, we'll continue these webinars. So with that, I'll again open it to questions.
So we have one question from Andy. It's a two-part question. Who determines the bill scheduling in the House? And then the second part is that the Rules Committee, and would there be any point in talking to them?
So the timing of the bills, it's leadership first, and then the Rules Committee. What the Rules Committee does is they set the rules for debate on the House floor. So if you want to introduce an amendment to a bill, you have to go to the Rules Committee, and they'll decide whether or not it's going to go further. When we get closer, it may be time to do that. At this point, my understanding is that they haven't even started the bipartisan debate on the bill yet. So we're a good month away from even a committee markup.
And a second question is from Michael. Are you worried that there are efforts to kill vulnerable road user safety assessments?
So vulnerable road user safety assessments, that's something we want in IIJA. It requires every state to do an assessment of where the high injury networks are for people biking, walking, rolling, people outside of cars. Am I worried about that going away? Yes, but I'm more worried that they'll just restrict it to certain states so that not every state has to do that. And that is a problem as well. Yeah, so I'm worried about that. There's also that funding piece that says that if you have 15% or more of your fatalities are bicyclists and pedestrians, you have to spend 15% of dollars on that. That's why we've seen that increase in highway safety. I'm worried that that is going to go away. So those are two things in the highway safety program I'm worried about.
And Steve Bingham just commented saying there will be a new stop underrides bill being introduced by Senator Gillibrand.
Yes. So there's a couple of vehicle safety things. A few years ago at the summit, we talked about truck side underride guards. That's what the Gillibrand bill will require. So that is something else that we're watching. Yeah, and we'll be promoting.
Those are all the questions we have thus far. So if there aren't any more, we'd like to thank you for your time. And we will be continuing to host these. So please, we will let you know. And thank you so much for your time and have a great rest of your weekend.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending, and feel free to reach out to either of us. If I didn't introduce Will at the beginning, he's our new federal policy fellow. So we're really excited to have him here, and you'll be hearing more from both of us.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.